Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I have two diagnostic studies to share with you, and as Ohini has just mentioned, we have 7 minutes for each. Given that the introduction's now taken 5 minutes, I'm not going to be able to do much other than to share with you a few very broad pointers to some of the findings in our study. In fact, two studies, one on governance and services, and one trying to drill a little more deeply into issues of capacity. The governance and services study was done primarily in Ghana, and the capacity study was done in 16 cities across 4 countries, the 4 Cities Alliance countries. Now, starting with governance, here, just to set the scene for a moment, we actually looked at a whole range of different dimensions of urban governance, from policy frameworks to administrative structures, fiscal frameworks, planning systems, land management systems, urban service delivery, transport, and we looked at political economy. And all of that we wrote up in a few hundred pages, I'm afraid. So what I'll do now is just share this with you. What we found was that as you've just seen in the previous slide, we start from a fairly strong position of strength in Ghana in some respects. We know the good macroeconomic data has been here, reasonable trends in terms of growth in the recent past, also good performance on poverty reduction, very high levels of urbanization in Ghana, around 52% of the population now already urbanized, moving to around 65% in the next 20 years or so. So very high percentage of population living in cities, and quite solid devolution frameworks in place. We heard this morning that around 7% of total government revenue is spent on the District Assembly Common Fund, which is the driver of the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system. And we also have another interesting feature in Ghana some countries could learn from. There's a uniform local government service, and this unified local government service actually also has an interesting feature. All local government employees are paid on the same pay scale and pay spine as central civil servants. So that actually has helped to boost capacity a little. So these are the sort of strong foundations, and various challenges and opportunities now present themselves within this framework. Whilst we have a fairly solid institutional and fiscal framework, we do find that sub-national levels of autonomy are constrained. And they're constrained by a number of things, including quite a lot of central political influence over local government, the way local government works, and also 1/3 of all elected members are actually appointed, or 1/3 of total members are appointed from the center. So that constrains the level of local democracy that we actually see. In terms of fiscal devolution, we have strong and very high dependence still on central government transfers. And although those transfers come in the form of a block grant, which should in theory give local governments quite a lot of freedom to plan and autonomy over the financing of services, in reality there's quite a lot of conditionality that works. Now, we haven't got time to go into that, but there are a few unilateral deductions that are made at the center, and there are other conditions that apply. So the intergovernmental fiscal transfer framework doesn't actually operate quite as an unconditional block grant system as intended. Other problems in the system, again, I don't have time to go into, but they'll be very familiar to most of you. Own source revenue is still pretty weak. If we look at the levels of main sources of revenue, property tax, for example, property tax doesn't figure as significantly as it should. In fact, in many cities that we visited, we found that trade licenses were almost more important than property tax. Now, that's a very curious position to be in. So there are a whole range of problems there. Then in terms of planning and land management, we have institutional weaknesses that constrain the remit of planning. We have poor implementation and poor enforcement of planning frameworks. which leads to all the familiar problems we've been hearing about, haphazard development, informality, and so on. And we have land management policies and ownership systems, laws and systems that actually constrain land optimization and constrain the ability of local governments to leverage the value from land because of the nature of how land is held. And also the lack of transparency in land registration. Then we have quite a lot of new innovations in the system here in terms of contracting and outsourcing. But again, some low value addition coming from this because of very poorly designed concession agreements and contracts in many cases. And rather poorly, the capital structuring has been put together in a rather poor manner. And consequently, many of the contracts don't really properly benefit the private operator who's coming in, nor do they benefit the city. And what actually happens in reality is the private operator who's left with the task of trying to finance a service that he doesn't properly have revenue for, ends up withdrawing from providing that service from those who can't afford to pay. So it leads to exclusion, and it's not at all what was intended. So a lot of strange anomalies coming out of the private sector participation. And superimposed on all of this, we have a kind of political economy that doesn't always work in the right way. I mean, we've seen and we've heard today about how in Africa there has been a lack of industrialization generally, and we see in cities the whole natural resource-based economy with very high dependence on commodities is leading to a situation where cities are largely consumption cities and with high levels of circuits of capital and rent seeking going on within cities, which is not the sort of sound basis on which you can sort of build and go forward. Many different forms of political influence and entrenched vested interest in the way services are run and how value is extracted from services. So all of that further undermines cities. And I think it's no use just talking about technology and knowledge and systems if you haven't actually changed the way the system works, the interests and incentives, the way the system operates. So how best to leverage capacity? There are a few entry points. We felt that looking at empowering urban government to deliver more inclusive growth would require quite a lot of administrative reform. Even though Ghana has made certain strides, there's still further to go to address those weaknesses we've mentioned. And it requires introducing new types of incentives that can actually disrupt the sort of practices, the entrenched behavior that I was just referring to. There are different types of incentive one could introduce so that it was in people's interest to actually provide services rather than exclude people from services and make money out of that. We also found that there's a lot of scope in re-examining the political settlements that govern land use and planning. I won't have time to go into all of those. And last but not least, we recognize that we have to address some of the fundamental capacity gaps. Now, capacity is something we always talk about, but something that troubles me, and I think Cities Alliance, is that usually when we talk about capacity gaps, we start thinking of training. Now, we're not talking about training here. We're talking about much more fundamental issues. And we're not only talking about financial capacity, which is the other area that people tend to gravitate to when they have this discussion. We accept that there's a lot of financial weakness in the system and there's more that can be done there. But actually what I want to spend time looking at, and the next few minutes will be spent looking at the findings of our second study on capacity, is do we even have the right staff in place? Do we have the right number? Are they doing the right things or not? And in many cases, there's a stark reality out there that demonstrates cities, whatever we load on them, whatever new ideas, new policies, new laws, new systems, new technologies, they're absolutely not going to be able to absorb those because they have massive capacity crunch in terms of staffing. So let's now move on. we conducted a study here across 16 countries, 16 cities in 4 countries. So these are the 4 countries. We looked at Ghana, we looked at Ethiopia, Uganda, and Mozambique. We had a different number of cities representing different populations and sizes from different countries. You can see from Ghana, we primarily drilled into 4 cities, and we looked at the staffing there. In Ethiopia, just 2. In Uganda, we had 7. And in Mozambique, we had 3 cities. But we had a sample of 16 that we started with. Now, we obviously were working with existing data constraints, problems in terms of making sure the data we got on staffing and on other, the contextual side of the cities in terms of its population, its service networks and so on, all had to be reasonably accurate. So allowing for those data gaps, we then moved into our analysis. And we developed a set of benchmarks as to what cities we felt should ideally have, what would be the right number of staff to deliver their existing range of services, not the range of services they should be perhaps providing in future to a large body of people who may currently be excluded, but even to the existing network, based on the existing network size, the existing population within the network, and the existing volumes of service being delivered through that network, we were able to work out what we felt cities should have. These benchmarks were built up on a whole series of layers. We took international benchmarks and we took international norms. We looked at some very detailed cadre and staffing reviews with time and motion studies in similar cities in developing countries. We took a very rich amount of data from India, where Indian cities have been doing a lot of work trying to benchmark their staffing. And we then adapted those for the African context. Cities in Africa function in a different way. They're lower density. There's much more urban sprawl. Networks have to spread across a larger area. So we tried to factor those things in. And we then had to bring in key variables that would drive the staffing that's needed in each function. So depending on whether we were looking at revenue operations in a city or public works or solid waste management, we used different variables. Solid waste management, we had to look at the size of the network, the total volume of waste being collected. For revenue, we had to look at the number of households and properties and so on. So we built up the benchmarks, and then we took in the data as to where cities stand at present. Now, the populations all vary, because in our cluster of cities, you'll see that the cities in Ghana had the largest population, partly because we had one city in this sample that was quite large, 2 million population, Kumasi. Elsewhere, we had a range of smaller towns, and you will see that both Uganda and Ethiopia, in Uganda we had 7 towns, all adding up to about 500,000 only. Ethiopia, 2 towns of 500,000. So very different sizes, but for each city we were then able to normalize the data and work out where they should be standing. Just an interesting point is if you take the managerial and technical staff as a ratio per population, you find these are the figures here. Ethiopia has the highest ratio of 1.4 managerial and technical staff to 1,000 people, but you'll see some of the other cities have much less than 1 per 1,000 population. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? This is where, I won't spend long here, this is where cities currently stand in terms of their staffing, aggregated by country. So across the range, there were 939 staff across the functions we looked at in Ghana. I should say we didn't look at every function, we looked at what we thought were key functions. Uganda just had 242 across the 7 cities, Mozambique 377, and Ethiopia 811. Next slide tells us, and that's the functional distribution. Also, how those staff split across core functions of finance, public works, solid waste, and so on, planning. Next slide tells us what cities should have. Now, we then took, for the given size and the given nature of the network, we'll see that actually Ghana should have just under 4,000 staff. It had some 900 and something. Uganda should have over 1,000, ideally, and so on and so forth. So these are the numbers. And then when you compare if we have the next graph where we look at an overlay, here we can see the same data but expressed by staffing gap. So there is the total gap. See, Ghana has nearly 2,800, a gap of 2,800 just across these 4 cities. And how that gap splits across different functions, you'll see a recurring theme: planning, finance, revenue, public works. These are all areas where there are big capacity gaps in terms of staff. I should also say that we did allow for different models of delivery. Some cities are outsourcing and some are not, so we made allowances for that. And we allowed for different levels of technology where cities are using different technology, because obviously models of service delivery, different technologies allow you to operate with different levels of staff. But our gap basically factors that in. Now, this is just another expression of the staffing gap by city, and you'll see that very long, that huge gap over towards the right is Kumasi, which seems to be extraordinarily understaffed in terms of the size. And it's interesting, that is one of the larger metropolitan cities of this country and in Africa. It's a very fast-growing city with very major staffing problems. So again, just reflect before you start loading cities with more and more things to do and more responsibilities. Look at who's doing it and look at what these people are capable of doing, not just in terms of numbers, but we'll go on in a moment to look at their qualifications, and we'll also have a glimpse at levels of pay. Right, so I haven't got time to go across all of this, but you'll see it does vary, but almost in every country, even down here in Uganda where the charts, the bar graphs are very low. They're low because, the numbers are small, but generally cities are looking like somewhere between many cities have 100% fewer people. I mean, they need 100% more staff than they've got. So let's now move on again and look at this staffing gap by function and city. Again, this is the same graph but broken down by function as well as city. I won't dwell into this. You will have a chance to look at the presentation. There is a Cities Alliance report that goes into more detail. But just again, because I'm sure my 15 minutes is up, the qualifications gap here also is alarming. What we found is that very few staff in these cities, very few staff actually had anything like a degree. And when I say anything like a degree or a diploma, we factored in degrees and diplomas. And the blue here represents degrees and diplomas. The orange color or brown color represents the number of staff who have not got degrees or diplomas, but at least have been on some formalized training. And the gray represents the rest. So not only do we not have enough people, but look at the qualifications, and then we expect them to implement all these fancy concepts we're coming up with. So this is a real worry, and I think it's something governments need to take seriously. And this is in the context of many donors consistently for many years telling the public sector it needs to downsize, it needs to cut its staff, it's over-bloated. We find that cities really struggle. If I could just move on, this is an example for each of the 16 cities we looked at, and we could do this for 30, 40, 50, or 100 if we had more time and money. We were able to generate for every city a specific level of data that doesn't just show what I've presented in aggregate form, but goes into a little more detail in terms of qualifications, in terms of the staffing gap. But also, if you look at the pyramids above, it also shows you where all the staff sit, because we've been looking at aggregate numbers and shortfalls, but often those people are in the wrong positions. You may have a reasonable number or even half reasonable number, but they may be all doing the wrong thing or at the wrong level of the hierarchy. Now look, the pyramid, this is a city, Ethiopia. This is Dire Dawa in Ethiopia. Now ideally it should look like the pyramid on the right. In fact, it looks like the pyramid on the left. So a whole lot of manual labor and relatively few senior people to do anything. Okay, so I have 2 minutes left, and I have 2 slides, I think, left. This is now beginning to look at the salary comparisons. How are these people paid compared to others. Now, this is just a snapshot of some people in some cities. So here we took predominantly engineering and planning, engineers and planners for Ghana, and we compared, blue is what they're being paid in different categories. So we've got senior staff like a coordinating director, a chief engineer, principal engineers, senior engineers, engineers, and assistant engineers. So here we go down the hierarchy of the engineers in management functions. And the blue represents what they're currently being paid. The brown is what a local private sector employee doing an equivalent job would be paid in the local private sector. The grey represents someone working maybe for an NGO, international NGO, doing an equivalent job. And finally, you can maybe ignore the yellow, which is someone working for Adam Smith International or Palladium or anyone else. These are the salary comparisons, and the ones that are very important here are looking at what people are being paid in relation to the local private sector, just a local employer who's working privately. And we'll see pretty big gaps. Also in Uganda, we looked at the same across different levels of engineer. Here we just looked at local government pay against private sector staff. And you'll see quite high variations. I mean, the municipal engineers in Uganda are being paid fairly equally, but when you get to the more senior levels, it makes it very worthwhile to leave the job and go and join the private sector. So not only have we not got enough staff, not only are they all in the wrong place, not only are they not qualified, but when they're senior, they want to go. So that's the situation we're left with in terms of capacity. Now let's fix cities. Thank you.